The Buried Secret of Stonehaven. She agreed to live in the house everyone avoided and discovered something that would change her destiny forever. Can you imagine a person's desperation to the point of accepting life in a place everyone believes to be cursed? It sounds like fiction, but this story truly happened in a forgotten corner of the Ozarks in 1958. Before we continue, I'd like you to think about the hardest decision you've ever had to make for your family. Leave it in the comments below. I'll read every one of them and would love to hear these stories of courage you carry. And if these narratives touch your heart, don't forget to subscribe to the channel because the end of this journey will surprise you in a way you never imagined. What this woman found in that abandoned house changed not only the course of her life, but the fate of an entire community. The March sun beat down relentlessly that afternoon on Stonehaven, a small settlement nestled between rocky hills and fields parched by drought. Red dust rose with every gust of hot wind, covering the modest wattle and daub houses and the aged faces of their inhabitants. Alice Smith walked slowly along the dirt road, carrying her youngest daughter, Laura, a mere 2.5 years old, in her arms. Clinging to her worn skirt was her other son, Peter, an 8-year-old boy with eyes too large for his thin face and an expression that already knew sorrow beyond his tender age. Alice was 27, but life had left deep marks on her face that made her appear much older. Her brown skin, once luminous and full of vitality, was now etched with a weariness that seemed endless and a pain that accompanied her every movement. Her curly hair, tied in a loose bun, escaped in rebellious strands all around. Her calico dress, which once had cheerful colors, was now faded and patched in several places, a silent testament to better times that seemed to belong to another life, almost as if they were memories of someone else. Alice wore no shoes. Her bare feet, cracked and covered in the region's characteristic red earth, knew every sharp stone and every thorn on the path she walked daily. It had been only 5 months since her husband, Joseph, had disappeared without a trace. There was no wake, no burial, not even a cross where she could bring flowers and talk to him on lonely afternoons. Joseph had left for Chicago, like so many other men from the area at that time, taking with him the promise to return with enough money to build a real home and offer a decent future to their children. For the first 2 months, irregular letters arrived with sparse news and some money that barely covered the beans, rice, and cornmeal for the week. But one morning, the letters simply stopped coming, as if a spell had been cast upon them. The silence that settled was heavy, suffocating, and relentless. Weeks turned into endless months. Some said he had been arrested by the police for not having papers. Others whispered about the dangers of big cities, of the swindlers who tricked honest workers and left them to their own devices in the dead-end streets of the big city. The truth never reached Stonehaven, only an emptiness that grew with each sunrise in Alice's chest and in the silent questions her children asked with their eyes. A woman's existence in Stonehaven depended entirely on having a man by her side. Without Joseph, Alice had become invisible to local society. She owned no land registered in her name, had no property. The little money she had saved quickly ran out, and her family could barely support themselves, let alone help a widow with 2 small children. Her parents had passed away years ago, victims of a yellow fever outbreak that claimed almost a dozen people in the village in a matter of weeks. Joseph was an only child, and his mother had also departed this world long ago. Alice was completely alone in a world that showed no pity for widows, nor compassion for children with an absent father. Colonel Sebastian Foster, a corpulent man with a stern gaze who owned most of the arable land and the only general store in the region, sent for her 2 weeks after the rumor of Joseph's permanent disappearance spread like wildfire. Alice entered the big house, the only two-story brick building in the entire village, her heart pounding and her 2 children clinging to her trembling hands. Colonel Sebastian was seated in a worn leather armchair, drinking moonshine, and didn't even lift his eyes when she crossed the creaking door. "My Joseph went looking for honest work to support us, buying provisions at your store," Alice said, her voice a fragile but determined thread. "He was a hard-working and upright man. I only ask that you let me stay in the small house where we lived. I can do any work, wash clothes, iron, cook, tend a garden, whatever is needed. I just need a roof to shelter my little children." Colonel Sebastian finally lifted his heavy head. His small, icy eyes scanned her from head to toe with pure contempt. "Alice, Joseph owed me a good sum on the ledger. The house where you lived is my property. I already have another family who needs it, a family with a man who can work my land and pay me what's due." Alice felt as if the ground had opened beneath her bare feet, ready to swallow her whole. "But Colonel Sebastian, we have nowhere to go. My children are small. They still need care. Just give me a little time until I can figure something out." The colonel let out a dry, cruel laugh that echoed through the room's walls. "Time costs money, woman, and you have neither. You have until Sunday to get your belongings out of there, and you can be grateful I'm being charitable. I could have thrown you out on the street the same day you stopped paying what you owe." Alice tried to plead once more, but Colonel Sebastian had already turned his attention back to his glass of moonshine, definitively ending the conversation. She left that big house with her children, feeling a chill in her soul that the scorching Ozark sun couldn't warm in the slightest. The entire world had become a dead end, a trap from which there was no escape. In the days that followed, Alice went from door to door through the village, offering her services in exchange for a small corner where she could lay out mats for her children to sleep. But the answers were always the same, spoken with embarrassment but firmness. Families were already too numerous. The harvest had been terrible that year, and money was scarcer than rain in August. A widow with 2 hungry mouths to feed represented a burden no one was willing or able to take on. Some kind-hearted women offered her a plate of food or a cup of coffee with brown sugar, looking at her with a pity that hurt more than direct rejection, but no one opened their doors to welcome her. She felt the weight of stares fixed on her back as she walked down the main street of the village. She clearly heard the whispers that abruptly ceased as she approached. Colonel Sebastian's decision was absolute law in that place, and helping Alice meant defying the man who controlled their lives, their debts, and their livelihoods. The loneliness formed an invisible but solid wall that separated her from all those she had once called neighbors and acquaintances. Sunday arrived like a death sentence, and Alice had to gather her few belongings that fit into a burlap sack: 2 old sleeping mats, 3 mended blankets, an iron pot, a clay pot, and her children's worn clothes. She sat under the sparse shade of a scrubby tree by the roadside, with Laura sleeping in her sweaty lap, and Peter staring fixedly at the horizon with a seriousness a child should never have, and wondered if starving to death by the roadside would be her final destiny. It was exactly at that moment of absolute despair that she heard about the house. Mrs. Benedicta, an elderly healer who lived on the outskirts of the village and whom everyone respected but also feared in equal measure, was the one who first mentioned the place. The old woman approached her with slow, careful steps, leaning on a gnarled wooden staff. Her dark, deeply wrinkled eyes seemed to hold the accumulated wisdom of entire generations. She offered Alice a piece of brown sugar and a gourd of fresh water from the clay pot.
"When destiny corners the sheep, my daughter,
said Mama Benedicta with a voice as raspy as a dry leaf. "Even the gentlest sheep finds the strength to climb the steepest mountain." Alice looked up, her eyes full of a silent despair that needed no words. "What mountain is left for me to climb, Mama Benedicta? No one in this village wants to know anything about me and my children." The elder pointed with her bony chin towards a distant hill where the ruins of an old construction were silhouetted against the orange sky of dusk. "Up there, the Tanner house has been abandoned since the times of the old conflicts." A fragile glimmer of hope, like a tiny ember resisting the wind, ignited in Alice's tight chest. "Why has it been abandoned for so long? Doesn't anyone own it?" Mrs. Benedicta quickly made the sign of the cross, almost instinctively. "No one in this world of the living owns it. They say it belongs to her, to the woman who cries in the well." The healer then told the story that all mothers in the region used to scare disobedient children. The house had belonged to Mrs. Helen Tanner, a woman of means and wounded pride during a turbulent political era. When the conflicts reached the village, her husband was shot dead in an ambush, and in the midst of all that bloody chaos, her only young daughter disappeared without a trace. Some said the girl had fallen into the well and drowned. Others swore she had been taken by strangers. Mrs. Helen went mad with so much suffering. They said she wandered through the fields for days and nights on end, crying and calling her daughter's name, until one morning they found her dead beside the dry well with an expression of frozen pain on her face. Since that fateful day, the village folk swore that her spirit remained there, trapped in that place. A chilling cry heard on windy nights, a premonition of bad luck for anyone who dared to profane her pain and her dwelling. "No one has lived there for over 40 years, concluded the old healer gravely. "They say the place brings misfortune, that it sickens children and scares away the luck of anyone who dares to live there." Alice swallowed hard, feeling a shiver run down her spine despite the suffocating heat. But then she looked at her children, at Peter, who trembled beside her, and at Laura, who slept oblivious to everything, so small and defenseless. What was the ghost of a desperate mother compared to the very real ghost of hunger, cold, and abandonment? A roof was a roof, even if it was inhabited by the deep sorrow of a restless soul. She didn't need to hear anything else to make her decision. That same afternoon, carrying her meager belongings on her back and with her 2 children as her only company, Alice began the steep climb to Tanner's Hill. The trail was almost invisible, a path swallowed by tall weeds and thorns that stretched like sharp claws on both sides of the narrow way. The sun began its descent, painting the sky with violent colors that looked like spilled blood, casting long and sinister shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. Peter gripped his mother's calloused hand tighter. "Mom, I'm scared of this place," the boy whispered, his eyes fixed on the ghostly silhouette of the house that grew before them with each step. Alice knelt down to his height and looked deep into his frightened eyes, forcing a smile her heart didn't feel. "You don't need to be scared, my son. It's just an old house that's asking for some love. We'll clean it up properly, get rid of the sadness stuck to the walls, and it will become our home. You're the man of the house now, and every man needs a castle to protect. Isn't that right?" She herself barely believed her own words, but courage is sometimes just a mask a mother wears to protect her young from the cruel world outside. The house was much larger and more ruined than it appeared from a distance. The earthen walls were cracked and crumbling in several places, and the roof of the main structure had practically collapsed, leaving the rotten wooden rafters exposed to the sky like the open ribs of a long-dead animal. A gate of worm-eaten wood, which must have once been imposing and well-made, now served only as a frame for a yard overgrown with tall grass and castor bean plants that grew unchecked, their dry branches pointing in all directions like threatening spears. Alice stopped before the ruined structure and felt a chill run through her entire body, a deep sense of melancholy that seemed to emanate from the cracked walls themselves. The air up there was heavy and damp, laden with the strong smell of mold and withered flowers. It was as if Mrs. Helen's agonizing pain had become impregnated in every piece of earthen wall and every broken tile scattered on the ground. With her shoulder, she pushed a heavy wooden door that hung from a single rusty hinge. The creak the door produced was a long, sharp groan that echoed in the oppressive silence of the twilight. The interior was plunged into deep shadows. The smell of mold and bat droppings was almost unbearable, making her eyes sting. The floor was made of broken and loose bricks, covered by a thick layer of red dust, dry leaves, and pieces of wood fallen from the ceiling. Thick cobwebs like lace covered all corners and hung from the ceiling like ghostly veils. There was no usable furniture, only remnants of rotten wood and shards of old crockery scattered around the room. She explored the rooms with extreme caution, desperately searching for a space that could offer some minimal protection for her family. Most of the rooms were completely exposed to the elements, but in a side annex, what must have formerly been the kitchen and the servants' quarters, she found a room whose roof, despite having some visible leaks, still seemed to resist the weight of time. The floor was a dirt floor, and in one corner there was a stone fireplace blackened by the soot of fires lit decades ago. It was very little, but it was a roof over their heads. It was shelter against the cold nights to come. Alice laid Laura on one of the blankets spread on the hard ground and immediately began the Herculean task of cleaning the area. She worked non-stop until the darkness was complete and absolute, sweeping with a makeshift broom, tearing off the sticky cobwebs with her bare hands, removing debris and wreckage with strength she didn't even know she still possessed. Peter helped her inside, her limited possibilities, carrying dry leaves out of the house, her initial fear replaced by the urgent need to help her mother in that impossible endeavor. When they finally managed to light a small fire in the old fireplace, the dancing flames cast a golden, comforting light on the peeling walls, momentarily pushing back the oppressive darkness that surrounded them. On that first, endless night, Alice couldn't close her eyes for an instant. Lying on the rough, cold ground, with her children huddled beside her seeking warmth, she listened intently to every sound from the surrounding woods, the solitary hoot of an owl, the frightening creak of the old ceiling timbers, the whistle of the wind coming through cracks and holes in the walls, and something else, a distant, faint sound that froze her blood. Was it just the night wind, or truly the anguished lament of a mother searching for her lost daughter? She closed her eyes with all her might and prayed silently to our Blessed Mother, the patron saint in whom she had always trusted. My Mother in heaven, protect my children this night. Give us strength to endure what comes. Keep us safe in this place forgotten by all. The first days in that abandoned house were the hardest Alice had ever faced in her difficult life. Survival became a war fraught from dawn until dusk. She woke before the first ray of sun touched the mountaintops and went down the hill to the spring, a journey of almost 2 miles that she made twice, carrying 2 heavy cans suspended on a pole over her aching shoulders. With that precious water, she prepared a thin gruel for her children and then walked to Stonehaven in search of any work that would earn her a few pennies. She washed other people's clothes on the smooth creek stones until her hands cracked and bled. pounded corn and other families' mortars until her arms throbbed with pain, or ventured into the dense woods to collect firewood that she then sold for a pittance. The money she earned barely bought a little cornmeal, rice, and beans at Colonel Sebastian's general store, where she had to endure the scornful gaze of the man who had thrown her out on the street. Sometimes, when luck smiled on her, some soft-hearted woman would give her the previous day's leftovers, but most of Stonehaven's residents avoided her as if she carried some contagious disease. When she walked through the dirt roads of Stonehaven, people averted their eyes or discreetly made the sign of the cross. The children who once played with Peter now ran to hide behind their mother's skirts when they saw him approach. The Tanner house was a heavy stigma, and she, by making that place her home, had become contaminated with its supposed curse in everyone's eyes. Mrs. Martha, Colonel Sebastian's authoritarian wife, a woman with a poisonous tongue and a heart as small as a dried seed, even said loudly in the church square so everyone could hear clearly, "That woman went looking for trouble in the haunted den. She'll bring bad luck and plague to all of Stonehaven, mark my words." Alice quickly learned to build an invisible armor around her wounded heart. She pretended not to hear the cruel words that were like stones thrown against her chest. She hardened her face not to show the deep pain that others' contempt caused her. She had no choice. It was the abandoned house or certain death under a bridge. One hot afternoon, after almost a full month living in those forgotten ruins, while trying to patch a part of her bedroom roof using large leaves and red clay, she heard Peter shout loudly from the yard. She ran in terror, immediately thinking of a venomous snake or a yellow scorpion. She found the boy near the old disused corrals, his eyes wide with surprise, pointing insistently at the packed earth. "Mom, look, the ground here makes a different sound. It seems hollow underneath." Alice, even exhausted from a day of hard work, paid attention to her son's observation. She kicked the spot Peter indicated with her bare foot. Indeed, the sound was completely different, a muffled echo that did not match the compact, hard earth of the rest of the yard. Curiosity, an emotion she thought she had lost forever, awoke within her like a small but persistent flame. With the help of a pointed piece of wood she found among the rubble, she began to dig the ground with determination. The earth was loose and soft, as if it had been disturbed many years ago and never properly compacted again. She had barely dug about 16 inches when the wood hit something solid that was definitely not stone. The sound was unmistakable, wood against wood. Her heart began to beat wildly in her chest. She knelt on the ground and with her calloused hands began to remove the earth with increasing frenzy. What she discovered was an old wooden trapdoor, almost completely destroyed by the soil's dampness, with an iron ring corroded by time and rust. Peter watched her with admiration, his childlike eyes shining with excitement. "What's that, Mom? Is it hidden bandit treasure?" Alice didn't answer immediately. An ancestral fear mingled with a strange and powerful anticipation. What she discovered was an old wooden trapdoor almost completely destroyed by the soil's dampness, with an iron ring corroded by time and rust. Peter watched her with admiration, his childlike eyes shining with excitement. "What's that, Mom? Is it hidden bandit treasure?" Alice didn't answer immediately. An ancestral fear mingled with a strange and powerful anticipation. With immense effort, she pulled the ring with all her strength. The rotten wood gave way with a dry crack, and the trapdoor crumbled into pieces, revealing an opening as dark as a wolf's mouth and a stone staircase that descended into the bowels of the earth. A cold, damp breath with a strong smell of ancient earth and buried secrets rose from that black hole, enveloping her completely and making her tremble from head to toe. She didn't know exactly what was down there in that darkness, but some inexplicable force compelled her to discover the mystery. It was as if the place itself, after testing her during those difficult weeks, had finally decided to reveal its deepest and most dangerous secret. "Stay here with your little sister and don't leave this spot for anything," she told Peter, with a seriousness that made the boy instantly understand the gravity of the moment. The sun was almost completely setting on the horizon, and the darkness inside that hole was total and impenetrable. Alice ran back to her humble room, lit an old kerosene lamp she had acquired at a used goods bazaar, and, with her heart pounding against her ribs, returned to the open trapdoor. Curiosity was now much stronger than any fear she might feel. She leaned over the edge of the dark hole. The stone steps were steep and slippery from decades of accumulated dampness. She took a deep breath, filling her lungs with courage, and began to descend with extreme care, the trembling light of the lamp projecting her dancing, distorted shadow on the compact earth walls. The air grew colder and denser with each step she descended. It smelled of absolute confinement, of centuries of accumulated dust. The cellar wasn't very large, just a space of approximately 43 square feet with a low, vaulted ceiling. It was evident that it had been deliberately excavated with planning to serve as a secret hiding place. At first, the faint light revealed only more cobwebs and the dry, cracked earth floor. But as she moved the lamp towards a specific corner, a dull metallic glint immediately caught her attention. There they were, covered by a thick, moldy, and torn canvas, 3 large chests of dark carved wood with hand-forged iron clasps and hinges. Beside them were several bundles wrapped in coarse fabrics that were falling apart at touch. An intense shiver of anticipation ran through Alice's entire body. Could this be what the legend of the house had hidden all this time? With visibly trembling hands, she placed the lantern on the dirt floor and approached the mysterious chests. They had no padlock or lock whatsoever. She lifted the heavy lid of the first one with effort. The interior left her completely breathless, but not from the gleam of gold that perhaps a naive part of her had expected to find there. The chest was lined with completely faded and discolored red velvet, and contained objects of strange and disturbing beauty. There were masks carved from green stone with severe and intimidating expressions, elaborate necklaces made of seashells and colorful stones, ceramic vessels painted with intricate designs of mystical animals and unknown gods, and strange statuettes of shiny black stone that reflected the lantern light with an almost supernatural glow. They were treasures, no doubt, but not the kind she had imagined in her most secret thoughts. They were treasures torn from the very earth, from forgotten ancestors, from a time long before the early settlers, the plantations, and the laments of women driven mad by grief. She felt as if she had stumbled upon the dormant heart of an entire people lost in time. She opened the second chest with still trembling hands and found more precious objects. Delicate combs carved from bone, clay stamps with incomprehensible symbols, and carefully folded several manuscripts made of tanned leather and thick yellowed paper, all covered with elaborate drawings and symbols she couldn't decipher, but recognized as the writing of ancient peoples. They were rare historical documents, like those the traveling schoolteacher had shown in an illustrated book years ago. Finally, in the third and last chest, on top of more carefully wrapped ceramic pieces, she found a single object wrapped in a fine linen cloth. A journal bound in genuine leather, whose time-yellowed pages were covered in elegant, tight calligraphy. She opened it with reverence and fear. The first page read in neat letters, "Personal Journal of Dr. Augustus Tanner, scholar and sinner in the eyes of God, year 1931. He was Mrs. Helen's husband. Alice delicately held a small clay statuette representing a warrior with an elaborate feather headdress. It was cold to the touch, as if it held within it all the chill of the years it had been buried, and seemed to vibrate imperceptibly with some contained ancient energy. She had no idea how much it could be worth in real money, but at that precise moment, sitting in the absolute darkness of the secret cellar, surrounded by the silent vestiges of a world completely lost in time, she felt the overwhelming weight of history in her calloused hands. She had not found the stolen money of some rebel, nor the hidden gold of a rich farmer. She had found something infinitely deeper, more important, and potentially more dangerous than any fortune in coins. She had found the stolen soul of an entire people, forcibly torn from its sacred resting place. She remained there motionless for long minutes while the lantern flame flickered, casting ghostly shadows on the damp walls, unaware that this discovery, far from representing her long-awaited salvation, was about to transform into her most terrible ordeal. She slowly ascended from the cellar, holding the leather journal in her hands, feeling its weight as if it were made of pure lead. She settled her children, who had already fallen asleep on the hard floor next to the dying fire, covered them carefully, and sat as close as possible to the faint light of the lantern. She opened the journal again, and with the tip of her index finger, followed the elegant, tight lines of faded ink. The story Dr. Augustus told in those yellowed pages completely captivated her and made her blood run cold in her veins. He was not just a common farmer. He was a man completely obsessed with ancient history, a voracious collector of Native American artifacts, as he proudly called them in the opening pages. The journal described with a precision bordering on coldness how he had spent entire years studying old colonial maps and bribing the elders of nearby villages to discover the exact location of an archaeological site that the region's legends described as sacred and absolutely untouchable territory. He finally managed to find it, hidden in a deep cave in the heart of the mountain range, protected by dense vegetation. With a group of men hired from the big city and armed to the teeth, he desecrated the sacred place without ceremony, taking absolutely everything of value they found. He described the act not as a criminal plunder, but as an important scientific rescue, saving the precious pieces from the ignorance and primitive superstition of the natives, as he literally wrote. Pride and contempt oozed from every carefully chosen word. A few pages later, the narrative began to turn darker and more disturbing. Dr. Augustus recounted in detail a violent confrontation with the old guardian of the sacred place, a shaman who, upon discovering the sacrilege committed, stood before him completely unarmed, only with eyes full of ancient sorrow and a contained fury that seemed to burn within. With a grave and measured voice, the elder pronounced a solemn warning that Dr. Augustus transcribed in his journal with a curious mixture of mockery and poorly disguised nervousness between the lines. The stone and clay you steal do not hold material wealth, but rather the sacred spirit of the ancestors. You have awakened greed, and it will be the venomous snake that bites your own descendants. The earth never forgets offenses. The innocent blood crying out from these violated tombs will find an echo in the walls of your own house until the end of time. Dr. Augustus had dismissed it as the incomprehensible delusion of an ignorant savage, but the subsequent entries in the journal became progressively more restless, paranoid, and incoherent. He wrote at length about heated disputes with his trusted men who wanted to sell the valuable pieces to intermediaries dealing with foreign collectors willing to pay fortunes. He spoke of human shadows he saw moving at the edges of the property during the early morning hours, of the constant and oppressive feeling of being watched by invisible eyes, of the absolute certainty that his former accomplices were secretly conspiring to steal his precious archaeological discovery. The initial joy of possession had quickly transformed into the sick fear of imminent loss. The last entry was dated June 1932. The calligraphy, once so neat and controlled, was now an almost illegible scribble, stained in some places by drops of what could be red wine or perhaps dried blood. The armed uprisings are drawing closer to the village. They say federal troops are advancing throughout the interior. But my true enemy is not the political upheaval sweeping the nation. It is Rogers, my former partner. I am absolutely certain he will come here. He will use all this widespread confusion as a perfect smokescreen to forcibly take what is rightfully mine by right of discovery. Helen cannot comprehend the gravity of the situation. She thinks they are just unimportant decorative objects. She doesn't understand that it is the living history of an entire civilization, and it belongs entirely to me. I have hidden absolutely everything in the secret cellar I had built. Never found. They'll find nothing even if they turn over every inch of this property. Let it all rot before he lays his filthy hands on my treasure. The supposed curse of the old shaman? What primitive and ridiculous nonsense. The only real curse is the insatiable greed of unscrupulous men. Alice slammed the journal shut, raising the small cloud of dust. A deep shiver ran through her body. The story of the woman crying in the well, Mrs. Helen's progressive madness, the inexplicable disappearance of the couple's young daughter, everything took on a new, terrible, and perfectly logical meaning. It wasn't the vengeful ghost of a dead woman cursing this forgotten place. It was the amplified echo of a conscienceless man's destructive greed. The family tragedy hadn't sprung from a supernatural spirit, but from the calculated desecration and deliberate theft of something sacred. She stared intensely towards the dark yard outside, towards the trapdoor leading to the secret basement. Now she perfectly understood the situation she was in. She hadn't found a saving treasure. She had stumbled upon the poisoned root of an ancient misfortune, a secret soaked in violence and blood that had lain dormant and latent beneath her feet for decades, patiently waiting. Alice pushed the heavy chests back into their corner in the basement, carefully covered the bundles with a moldy canvas tarp, and climbed the stone steps. With red earth and heavy stones, she completely covered the trapdoor entrance again, desperately trying to erase any visible trace of the opening, as if by hiding it from sight, she could also bury the terrible and dangerous knowledge in her own mind. She couldn't touch it, not at all. It was cursed, dangerous money, born of an unforgivable sacrilege against the dead. She desperately tried to go on with her life as if absolutely nothing had happened. She would rise with the first light of dawn, go down the hill in search of fresh water, look for work around the village, but the heavy knowledge of what lay buried beneath her feet constantly tormented her. Every time she lit the fire to cook, she imagined the green stone masks staring fixedly at her from the darkness of the basement. Every time her innocent children played in the yard, she felt they were running and jumping over a deep tomb of deadly secrets and ancient violence. Dr. Augustus's journal she had tucked into the bottom of her burlap sack, a constant and threatening reminder of the mortal danger she had unwittingly invited into her desperate refuge. The story of rampant greed and complete ruin repeated incessantly in her head like a somber tune, and the terrible warning of the old shaman echoed in her ears like a death knell. During the days that followed the discovery, she lived with her soul permanently on edge, jumping at every strange noise, fearing that the menacing shadow of some descendant of Rogers or Dr. Augustus's old accomplices might appear knocking at her fragile door at any moment. 10 days after finding the cursed artifacts, little Laura fell gravely ill. It started with a dry, persistent cough that progressively worsened with each passing hour. The nights grew colder and wetter in that ruined house, and the penetrating dampness seeped through all the cracks and holes in the earthen walls. Soon, the persistent cough turned into a raging fever that made the girl delirious and call out for people who weren't there. Her tiny body burned with fever. Her lips became dry and cracked, and her breathing was a harsh, painful wheeze to hear. Alice did absolutely everything she knew and that her mother had taught her. She prepared medicinal teas of horehound and mint, applied cold wet cloth compresses to her feverish forehead, and recited all the prayers and novenas her grandmother had taught her in childhood, but the stubborn fever wouldn't yield even a little. Laura completely stopped eating anything, refusing even sips of water, and spent the endless days and nights in a worrying state of lethargy, interrupted only by violent fits of coughing that left her purple and breathless, trembling from head to toe. Peter, terrified by his little sister's condition, didn't leave her side for an instant, watching her with his wide eyes overflowing with a devastating helplessness that broke his mother's already shattered heart into 1,000 pieces. Alice knew very well that the home remedies she knew wouldn't be enough this time. Laura urgently needed a real doctor, modern medicines that could only be bought at the pharmacy in the big city, a full 2 days' journey away. And that cost a lot of money, more money than she had seen combined in her entire life of privations. In the cold dawn of the 4th day of illness, the girl had a terrifying seizure. Alice panicked completely, holding her tightly in her arms, feeling her fragile little body shake violently out of control, her little eyes rolling completely back, showing only white, and a thin line of white foam appearing at the corner of her purplish lips. "My daughter will die here in my arms," she thought with terrifying and crystalline clarity. "My daughter will die from a curable disease, and I can do absolutely nothing because I am poor and abandoned." It was exactly at this precise moment of total and absolute despair, with Peter's desperate cry in the background and Laura's small body convulsing uncontrollably in her trembling arms, that Alice made a decision that would change everything. In her tormented mind, she clearly saw the green stone figures and the ancient ceramic vessels. She saw the shaman's terrible warning etched in the journal's pages. "Greed will be the serpent that bites your descendants." But would it truly be greed to desperately want to save her daughter's life? Or was the true unforgivable curse to let her die there out of pure fear of ghosts and superstitions? The moral dilemma tore her apart inside like a sharp knife, but when she looked intently at her daughter's face, pale as death and covered in cold sweat, the answer came instantly and viscerally like a punch to the gut. To hell with all curses and all ghosts of men dead for decades. There was no spirit, no legend, no fear in this world greater than the terror of a mother about to lose her young daughter. With fierce determination born of absolute despair, she carefully laid Laura on the floor, firmly asked Peter to watch over his sister without leaving her side, and ran like a madwoman to the yard, to the exact spot where the dry earth guarded its deadly and forbidden secret. With a strength she didn't know she still possessed, born of maternal love and pure despair, she dug into the hard earth with her bare hands until her nails broke and began to bleed. She uncovered the trapdoor entrance, rushed down to the basement without even bothering to light the lantern to see, and blindly in the complete darkness searched the first chest. Her fingers touched the coldness of the green stone, and she grabbed the first piece she found. An elaborate necklace made of perforated green stones, intertwined with ancient gold threads, no longer than her forearm, but surprisingly heavy. She didn't stop to examine anything else for a second. She ran up the steps, quickly covered the hole with earth and stones again, and wrapped the valuable necklace in an old piece of fabric, hiding it at the bottom of her burlap sack. She ran desperately, with Laura burning with fever in her arms, to Mrs. Benedicta's simple house. The elder woman received her in complete silence, observed and watched intently the raging fever in the child's glazed eyes, and the feverish, almost insane determination in the desperate mother's eyes. "Take care of her for me, Mama Benedicta, for the love of God and all the saints. I'll be back tomorrow before nightfall with the medicine that will save her. I swear on my mother's sacred memory that I'll return," Alice pleaded, her voice completely choked. Mrs. Benedicta nodded gravely, her deep, dark eyes filled with a sad, ancient wisdom, and took the girl delicately in her fragile arms. She asked no uncomfortable questions, but Alice felt with absolute certainty that the old wise woman knew perfectly well, or at least clearly intuited, that she was about to cross a very dangerous frontier from which there might be no return. She left Peter in the old woman's care, gave him a lingering kiss on his sweaty forehead, and without looking back once, began walking with determination down the dusty road that led to the big city, to the capital city. She walked for endless hours under the relentless March sun, and when night finally fell, bringing the chill of the mountain range, she continued walking without stopping under the silvery, ghostly light of the full moon. Fear and pure adrenaline were the only fuel that kept her shaky legs moving. Each painful step was a whispered prayer for her daughter's life. The green stone necklace at the bottom of her sack seemed to weigh an entire ton. A cold and dangerous secret pressed against her bruised back. She reached the outskirts of the capital city as the rising sun began to paint the sky pink and orange. Completely exhausted, covered head to toe in red dust, and utterly disoriented by the deafening noise of the first electric streetcars and the frantic movement of hurried people. Never in her life had she been in such an immense and frightening place. She felt minuscule and completely invisible among so many people. For endless hours she wandered through the wide downtown streets, lacking the courage to enter the elegant, well-kept shops that displayed expensive goods in their gleaming windows. Finally, on a narrow, dimly lit street away from the main thoroughfare, she spotted a small shop with a faded sign that read, "Antiques and Rarities, Buy and Sell." The establishment had a dusty, mysterious air that gave her the courage needed to push open the glass door. A middle-aged man, thin as a dry branch, with gold-rimmed glasses and small, shrewd eyes like those of a hunting hawk, received her from behind a counter completely crammed with strange objects of all kinds. Alice, her voice trembling with nervousness and exhaustion, carefully unrolled the green stone necklace and placed it on the scratched counter with reverence. The man's eyes widened visibly for a fraction of a second, an unmistakable flash of pure greed that he quickly controlled, subsequently adopting a studied expression of only moderate interest. The dealer picked up the precious piece with fingers that trembled slightly, examined it meticulously with a jeweler's loupe, and weighed it repeatedly in his bony hand. His heart beat erratically in his narrow chest. He knew perfectly well that he had before him an authentic, ancient tribal artifact, an extremely rare museum piece worth a true fortune on the international black market for antiquities. "Where did you get this, my child?" he asked with an artificially kind and paternal voice. "It belonged to my great-grandmother, who was Native American," Alice lied quickly, repeating the only story she had managed to invent during the long night's walk. She kept it as a family heirloom for many generations. The man let out a short, false chuckle. Well, your great-grandmother certainly had refined taste, but this isn't all that special. It must be a well-made imitation, perhaps from the last century. I can give you $300 for it, and that's taking a huge risk. Alice understood absolutely nothing about market values or ancient art. $300 sounded like an unattainable fortune, more than enough to pay any doctor and buy all the medicine needed to save her daughter. She nodded positively, too anxious to finish the transaction quickly and rush back home. The man handed her a thick wad of crumpled bills and quickly put the valuable necklace in a locked drawer beneath the counter, as if he feared she might change her mind. As Alice hurried out of the shop, clutching the money against her chest as if it were her daughter's very life, she intensely felt the weight of the man's calculating gaze fixed on her back. It wasn't a casual farewell glance. It was the penetrating, dangerous gaze of an experienced hunter who had just found a fresh and extremely promising trail of valuable prey. She had managed to save her daughter, but she felt deep within her soul that she had just sold her peace of mind and her safety for a handful of paper bills. With the precious money tucked deep in her sack, Alice didn't waste a single second. She ran to the office of the first doctor she could find, a serious, gray-haired gentleman who attended to her with poorly disguised impatience, but at least listened to her. She bought all the imported penicillin vials and large bottles of expectorant syrup he prescribed on a scribbled note, spending almost all the money she had received. Without resting for a minute, she immediately embarked on the journey back, a trip fueled by a powerful mix of renewed hope and constant panic. The sun rose and set again as she continued walking without stopping, her blistered, painful feet protesting with every torturous step, her mind completely fixed on the image of her agonizing daughter. She arrived at Mrs. Benedicta's humble home the following dawn, stumbling on the verge of total physical collapse. The girl was even paler, her breathing so faint that the movement of her little chest was barely perceptible. Mrs. Benedicta had stayed awake all night, making cold compresses and giving sips of warm tea, keeping the child alive basically through sheer willpower and prayer. Without saying a single word, Alice tremblingly prepared the first penicillin injection, her hands shaking so much from exhaustion and nervousness that she could barely hold the glass syringe correctly. With the patient help of the wise woman, she administered the life-saving medicine to the sleeping child and then began the longest vigil of her life. For 3 endless days and 3 nights, she didn't leave her side for an instant, administering the full treatment with almost religious precision, praying incessantly in silence, eating almost nothing, and sleeping only a few minutes at a time. On the morning of the 4th day, the miracle finally happened before her disbelieving eyes. The terrible fever had completely broken. Laura's breathing was no longer that frightening death rattle, but rather a quiet, regular murmur of restorative sleep. The girl slowly opened her little eyes, and instead of the glazed, distant expression of severe illness, Alice finally saw the unmistakable spark of life returning. Still weak, but definitely present and real. "Mama," the child whispered hoarsely. Alice collapsed over her, not with the weight of her body, but with the entire crushing weight of her relieved soul, and cried copiously. She cried with relief so profound and overwhelming that it was almost physically painful. Her desperate gamble had worked against all odds. Her daughter would live. 2 weeks passed, and Laura was already running and playing soccer again through the yard, still too thin, but full of renewed energy. Alice felt an immense and priceless gratitude towards Mrs. Benedicta and an inner peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. The supposed ancient curse now seemed distant and abstract, just a scary story read in a dusty book by a man dead for decades. But the news of the girl's seemingly miraculous recovery, and especially of the mysterious money that had made it possible, spread quickly through the small Stonehaven like wildfire.
Absolutely no one believed the poorly told story of the Native American great-grandmother's inheritance. The looks of pity mixed with contempt quickly turned into looks filled with suspicion and thinly veiled envy. Where exactly had so much money come from for a miserable widow living alone in the haunted house on top of the hill? The rumors inevitably reached the ever-attentive ears of Colonel Sebastian, and his small, avaricious eyes gleamed with renewed interest. Had the woman accidentally found some hidden treasure from the times of old conflicts buried on that abandoned property? The idea settled firmly in his greedy mind and gave him no peace. Alice's precarious tranquility lasted a very short time. She began to feel the heavy gazes on her again wherever she went, but this time they were completely different, more calculating, infinitely more dangerous and threatening. She felt a concrete threat hanging in the warm air, a growing tension she couldn't identify the source of, but which made all the hairs on her body stand on end. 5 days after returning to the house on the hill with her children, who were now fully recovered, while gathering dry kindling near the ruins of the old stables, she clearly heard the unmistakable sound of approaching horses. It was not common for anyone to come up here. Her heart raced uncontrollably. She carefully peeked through the thorny bushes and saw 3 men on horseback stopped right in front of the collapsed main entrance of the property. They were not from the village, that was obvious. They wore city clothes, polished leather boots, and wide-brimmed hats that shadowed their faces, making it impossible to see their features clearly. One of them, a stocky and muscular fellow with a nasty scar running across his face from eye to chin, dismounted from his horse with calculated movements. The other 2, one tall and thin as a post, and another of medium build but threatening demeanor, remained mounted, observing the surrounding ruins with cold, predatory eyes, like those assessing a cornered prey. Alice was completely paralyzed where she stood. Absolute terror left her gasping for air. She knew with an unshakable and terrifying certainty exactly why those men were there at that moment. They were the direct and inevitable consequence of her desperate trip to the capital city. The concrete answer to the hawk-eyed antique dealer's greedy question. "Woman," shouted the one with the horrible scar, his deep voice echoing in the oppressive silence of the afternoon. "We know very well you're hiding in there. The boss from the capital city told us you have more beautiful pieces saved to show us. Come out and let's talk like civilized people. We won't harm you if you cooperate properly with us." The veiled but clear threat was as evident as the midday sun burning their heads. The brief period of peace and relief had ended abruptly. The real curse was not some ghost from another world, but the insatiable greed and violence of living men, and it had just knocked hard on her fragile door. Alice's heart hammered violently against her aching ribs. Her children were playing innocently inside the makeshift room, completely oblivious to the mortal danger inexorably approaching. Her powerful maternal instinct, infinitely stronger than any fear she might feel, took absolute control of her actions. She slowly emerged from among the bushes where she was hiding, raising her hands slowly to clearly show that she was completely unarmed and harmless, desperately trying to project a calm and confidence she was far from feeling. "I don't know what you gentlemen are talking about," she said, with a voice that, to her surprise, came out firm and controlled. "As you can see with your own eyes, this place is falling apart. Only my 2 small children and I live here. We are poor people. We have nothing of value to offer."
The man with the terrible scar, who was clearly the leader of that dangerous group, let out a harsh, completely joyless laugh. He approached her with slow, deliberately threatening steps, like a jaguar carefully circling its prey before the fatal pounce. "Don't try to fool us, woman. The old man at the shop described the piece you sold us precisely. That's not something poor people keep at the bottom of an old chest. We know very well the legend of this cursed house, the rebel's treasure, or whatever it is that's buried here. Tell us where it's hidden, and we'll leave in peace, leaving you and the boys alone. If you don't want to cooperate, my companions and I here will have to search this entire place from top to bottom, and we are very thorough in our work. We wouldn't want to scare the innocent children in the process." His cold eyes briefly shifted towards the makeshift door of Alice's room, and the implicit threat against her children froze her blood in her veins like ice. Alice felt a visceral and primitive terror, but the mere mental image of her children in danger gave her an unsuspected strength she didn't even know she possessed. She stood upright and firm. "I swear on the soul of my vanished husband that you gentlemen are completely mistaken. That piece I sold was the only and last thing I had left from my family. I sold it only to buy medicine and save my daughter who was dying of fever. There's nothing else here. You can believe me." The bully smiled with calculated cruelty, a horrible grimace that didn't even reach his cold, empty eyes. "A very moving story indeed, I must admit. Too bad we don't believe a bit of it." He took another threatening step towards her, his large, calloused hand reaching out to grab her arm forcefully. But his sentence was suspended in the air, abruptly cut short by a completely new masculine voice, calm but laden with an undeniable natural authority. "Am I interrupting something important here?" Everyone instinctively turned towards the unexpected voice. A man stood exactly at the beginning of the narrow trail that led up to the abandoned property. He was not from the village, that was immediately clear. He appeared to be around 55 years old, with well-cut gray hair and an intelligent, attentive expression behind modern framed glasses. He wore a beige linen dress shirt and well-pressed khaki pants, typical clothing of someone from the big city, but who was clearly accustomed to working in the field. Beside him was a younger man, probably in his mid-20s, with a studious and nervous appearance, holding a clipboard with papers and observing the entire scene with wide eyes of apprehension. Further down the trail, partially hidden by the trees, an olive-green Jeep was parked, old but extremely well-maintained. Alice immediately recognized the older man with a start. He was the doctor who had treated her daughter in the capital city, the one who had asked gentle questions, more insistent questions about its origin and history while examining Laura. The three men on horseback visibly tensed, carefully assessing the unexpected newcomer. He didn't seem to represent a direct physical threat, but his sudden and unexpected presence was definitely an unwelcome complication. "Don't meddle in affairs that don't concern you, sir," growled the one with the scar in a menacing voice. "We're having a private conversation here with the property owner." The doctor completely ignored the bully and fixed his gaze directly on Alice. He clearly saw the absolute panic stamped in her eyes and the instinctive way she positioned herself protectively between those dangerous men and the door where her children were. "Mrs. Alice," he said in a firm and calm voice, "I came here specifically looking for you. After I treated your daughter in my office and heard your story, I became extremely intrigued. I am Professor Dr. Frederick Adams, an archaeologist from the State University and director of the State Historical Museum. This here is my research assistant, Richard." The young man nodded shyly, his hands nervously clutching the clipboard against his chest. "I managed to track down the exceptional piece you sold at that antique store downtown," the professor continued seriously. It is an authentic and extremely rare piece of Cherokee culture, probably from the 14th or 15th century, of incalculable historical and scientific value. That dishonest merchant paid you a ridiculous fraction of its real value and was already trying to sell it illegally to foreign collectors when we managed to intervene and seize the piece with the help of federal authorities. He is now in jail, facing charges for trafficking national historical artifacts. Alice's eyes widened, slowly assimilating the words. The three men on horseback exchanged quick, meaningful glances, clearly recalculating the completely altered situation. The professor continued speaking, now addressing the intruders directly with an authority that made even the bullies imperceptibly retreat. And I imagine you gentlemen are here for the same base motive, aren't you? You came to intimidate and threaten a defenseless woman and her young children to steal archaeological artifacts that legally belong to American cultural heritage. We are just debt collectors, Doctor, lied the man with the scar with surprising ease. The late Mrs. Helen Tanner, who owned this house, owed money to our boss. We only came to collect what is rightfully ours. How interesting, replied the professor with a cold smile that conveyed no sympathy. Because Mrs. Helen Tanner passed away more than 25 years ago, and all her debts expired decades ago. Furthermore, this property was formally abandoned and reverted to the county due to lack of legal heirs 15 years ago. Any claim of old debt is completely null under the law. But all right, if you gentlemen want to discuss this in detail, my assistant here can call the state police headquarters right now, and you can formally present your documents. Richard took a two-way radio from his shirt pocket, making it clear that the threat was not empty. The three men looked at each other again. The situation had completely changed. It was no longer a lone and vulnerable woman, but witnesses from the capital city, university authorities, and the concrete possibility of law enforcement involvement. The leader spat angrily on the dusty ground. "This isn't over like this," he said in a low, menacing voice, pointing a thick finger in Alice's direction. "We'll leave for now, but we'll be back for what's rightfully ours." He mounted his horse with a brusque movement, and the three galloped off down the trail, raising clouds of red dust. The professor waited until the sound of hooves was completely lost in the distance before approaching Alice, who had collapsed to her knees on the ground, trembling convulsively from relief and delayed shock. "Thank you, Doctor," she managed to say with a choked voice. "You saved us. They were going to—" Her voice completely failed. "I know exactly what they intended to do," the professor said gently, helping her up carefully. "And honestly, they will return when they realize we're gone. Men like that don't give up easily when money is involved. But we can resolve this in a way that completely protects you and your children." Alice looked at him with a mixture of desperate hope and learned distrust. "How so, Doctor?" The professor took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. "Mrs. Alice, I need to be completely honest with you. That piece you sold didn't just appear out of nowhere. Pieces of that quality and authenticity are part of larger sets, of complete archaeological sites. I have researched the history of this property extensively in recent weeks. I know about Dr. Augustus Tanner and his unauthorized expeditions, about the rumors of a hidden collection. If there are more artifacts here, they don't belong to anyone individually. They belong to the American people, to our collective history. And even more importantly, as long as they are hidden here, you and your children will be in constant danger." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But if you voluntarily collaborate with the university, officially handing over any artifacts that exist here for proper study and preservation, I can guarantee several important things. First, you will receive fair financial compensation, not a fortune, but enough to start a decent life somewhere safer. Second, your name will be officially registered as a discoverer and collaborator, which will give you legal protection. Third, and most importantly, the university will take official legal possession of this property to transform it into a protected archaeological site, which means permanent security with guards and a fence. Those men will not be able to return here. Alice looked at the door where her children had finally appeared, startled by the shouts. She looked at the ruined house that had become her improbable home. She looked at the ground where the terrible secret was buried. The decision was obvious, crystal clear. There was no real choice. "There are more things, Doctor," she said softly. "Much more. In the secret basement. I didn't want to touch it, I swear I didn't, but my daughter was dying, and I had no other way. I read Dr. Augustus's diary. I know he stole everything from a sacred place. I know about the curse." Her voice trembled. "I just want my children to be safe and in peace." "You can take everything. I don't want any of it near us anymore." The professor placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "You did what any mother would do, and there is no shame in that. We will resolve everything the correct way now. Richard, call the team waiting in town. We need security and documentation equipment." In the weeks that followed, the old Tanner property transformed into a true hive of activity. A complete team of archaeologists, university students, and specialized technicians took over the place. They installed professional tents, lighting equipment, and a security perimeter with hired guards. Alice guided them to the secret basement and watched with a mixture of relief and melancholy as they carefully cataloged and removed each piece, each object, each ceramic fragment. There were a total of 147 individual pieces, plus 3 extremely rare and well-preserved animal skin codices. Professor Frederick explained with restrained emotion in his voice that it was one of the most significant archaeological discoveries in decades in the state, a collection that would rewrite part of what they knew about the trade routes and ceremonial practices of the Native American peoples of the region in the centuries before colonization. "These pieces will finally return to where they belong," he said solemnly as he supervised the careful packing of a particularly beautiful ceremonial mask. In museum displays where thousands of people, especially children and students, can learn about their ancestors, where they should have been for decades. Throughout the process, Alice kept her children close, watching but not participating. A part of her still feared some spiritual retribution, some vengeance from the profaned spirits. But as the days passed and the house was gradually emptied of its toxic secrets, she felt something subtly change. The heavy, oppressive air that always hung over the place seemed to slowly dissipate. The shadows on the walls no longer seemed so threatening. Perhaps it was just her imagination, but Alice swore that even the birds had returned to sing around the property, something that hadn't happened since she arrived there months ago. On the last night before the team departed for good, Professor Frederick called Alice for a private conversation. He handed her a thick, sealed envelope. "Inside is an official bank check from the State University for the agreed-upon amount, enough for you to buy a modest house in town, support your children for at least 2 years, and perhaps start a small business," he explained. "There are also official documents registering your voluntary collaboration, which legally protects you from any accusation of illegal possession of artifacts. And last but not least, there's a letter of recommendation from me for the local government's adult literacy program. An intelligent and courageous woman like you deserves the chance to learn to read and write properly." Alice held the envelope with both hands, her hands that had dug the earth, washed clothes, cared for sick children. It was heavy with possibilities. "Why are you doing all this for me, Doctor? I stole that piece. No matter the reason, I stole it." The professor shook his head firmly. You stole nothing. You found something that was lost and abandoned and used it to save your daughter's life. That's not theft, it's survival. The one who stole was Dr. Augustus Tanner decades ago, desecrating tombs and destroying archaeological contexts out of pure vanity and greed. You merely partially corrected that historical error, returning everything to society. Before departing the next morning, the professor made a point of performing a small informal ceremony. He invited Alice and her children, Mrs. Benedicta, who had climbed the hill with difficulty but with determination, and some key members of his team. At the exact spot where the secret basement had been, now completely empty and clean, he lit native herb incense and pronounced words he had learned from an elder of a nearby village, asking forgiveness from the spirits for the ancient desecration and giving thanks for the opportunity to correct the error. Mrs. Benedicta offered her own prayers in a mixture of an old mountain dialect and an ancient tongue that few still knew. Alice, holding her children's hands, closed her eyes and also prayed in silence, asking forgiveness for having touched what she shouldn't have, giving thanks for Laura's life, pleading for protection and a more peaceful future. When she opened her eyes, the afternoon sun filtered through the surrounding trees, creating golden patterns on the ground. And for the first time since she had arrived at that cursed place, Alice genuinely felt that there could be hope. 3 months later, Alice and her children were settled in a small but solid house on the outskirts of a larger town, with real walls, a roof that didn't leak, and a smooth concrete floor. Peter was enrolled in a decent public school, where he was quickly catching up on his education. Laura played in the tiny but safe yard, completely healthy and full of life. Alice had started working at a cooperative laundry, earning a modest but decent and regular wage. 3 times a week, she attended night literacy classes, struggling with the letters that danced on the page, but determined to master them. The old Tanner house, now officially designated as the Stonehaven Archaeological Site, had been fenced off and transformed into a small field museum. School groups visited regularly, learning about the Native American peoples of the region and the importance of preserving cultural heritage. A discreet plaque at the entrance read, "Discovered with the collaboration of Alice Smith, 1958. It wasn't much, but it was recognition, a small part of history that would carry her name for future generations. Alice never returned to that place, not out of fear or superstition, but simply because that chapter of her life had definitively closed. The nightmares of jade masks and crying spirits gradually disappeared. The guilt she carried for having violated something sacred was slowly replaced by the understanding that she had, ultimately, helped correct an ancient injustice. A year after the discovery, on a regular Saturday afternoon, Alice received an unexpected visit. It was Professor Frederick, accompanied by an elderly woman with distinct Native American features, long white hair, and a deep gaze that seemed to pierce through people. "Mrs. Alice, I'd like to introduce Mrs. Urema," the professor said respectfully. "She is a shaman from the Cherokee village of the Cherokee Valley, a direct descendant of the people whose artifacts were stolen by Dr. Augustus Tanner." Alice felt her heart quicken, a flash of ancient fear returning. Was it an accusation? A condemnation? Mrs. Urema approached slowly and, to Alice's surprise, took her hands in hers, which were surprisingly strong and warm. "I came here to thank you," the elder woman said in a soft voice laden with emotion. "I came to thank you for returning the ancestors to us. For decades, our shamans felt that something was wrong, that pieces of our history and our soul were lost, imprisoned in darkness. You, unknowingly, without understanding, broke the prison. You freed what was trapped." Alice felt tears burn her eyes. "But I only did it because I was desperate. I sold a piece for money to save my daughter. It wasn't out of nobility or kindness." The shaman smiled with immense gentleness. And you think the ancestors don't understand a mother's love? Do you think they, who were also mothers, fathers, grandparents, don't recognize what you did? You profaned nothing. Those who profane are those who take out of greed, out of vanity, out of pride. You touched out of necessity and then returned everything when you could have kept it, sold more. That requires courage and integrity. She squeezed Alice's hands more tightly. The earth does not forget, that is true, but the earth also does not condemn those who act with a clean heart. You and your children are free from any spiritual burden. I came personally to bring this message of peace. That night, after the visitors left, Alice sat on the small porch of her house and watched her children playing under the soft glow of the street lamp. Peter laughed loudly as he pretended to be an airplane, with Laura running after him trying to catch him. These were sounds of normal childhood, of carefree joy, sounds she had feared she would never hear again in those dark days in the abandoned house. She thought of everything that had happened, of the impossible journey she had undertaken. From a desperate widow sleeping in haunted ruins, threatened by men violent and haunted by guilt, she had transformed into a woman with her own home, with safe and healthy children, with a future ahead. Her life story would never be easy. There were still obstacles ahead, but at least now there were real possibilities. The curse of the Tanner house, she finally realized, had never been supernatural. It was the very human curse of greed, disrespect, and violence disguised as erudition. And the breaking of this curse didn't come from magic or elaborate rituals either, but from the simple and profoundly human decision to do the right thing, even when it came at a high cost. To choose her daughter's life over fear. To choose returning what didn't belong to her over the temptation to get rich. To choose truth over convenient silence. She looked up at the starry sky above the small town. Somewhere distant, in a village she would never visit, the artifacts she had found were being prepared for ceremonial return to the people to whom they always belonged. Somewhere, Mrs. Helen's restless soul might finally rest, free from the prison of secrets and her husband's greed. And here, on this small but real piece of solid ground, she and her children were finally, truly safe and free. And so ends this extraordinary journey of courage, despair, discovery, and redemption. If this story touched your heart in any way, I would be very happy if you subscribe to the channel here. Stories like these remind us that even in the most desperate situations, there is still dignity, choices, and the possibility of doing what's right. I'd love to know, have you ever had to make an extremely difficult decision to protect those you love? Have you ever been in a situation where you had to choose between immediate survival and important principles? Share your story here in the comments. This space is ours, a community where we can learn from each other, where every story of struggle and overcoming deserves to be heard. What did you learn from Alice Smith's journey? Leave your reflection below and let's build this space of welcome and mutual learning together. Until the next story.